Let's take a look at the 2016 Macro FRQ question number 2. This one deals with bank balance sheet. Right, there it is. Okay, so pretty straightforward question. All right, so up here we have the following is the balance sheet of First Superior Bank. We got assets, liabilities. Now always remember that assets are always going to be equal to liabilities. And this balance sheet is actually pretty straightforward. And then this is important to note, reserve ratio is 10%. We're going to need that pretty much right off the bat and in later parts of the question as well. Okay, so the one thing to note about this is that assets are broken up into just loans and reserves. Sometimes you will get a different type of T-chart where it has a category that's called required reserves. In this case, they want you to kind of make that calculation and distinction. So it's good to do that to figure out how much of this is required reserves, which is going to be 10% of our demand deposits, right? So let's take 10% of 2,000, right? So that should be 200. So right off the bat, question 1A, we need what is the dollar value of new loans that First Superior can make with its existing balance sheet? Well, that actually is going to be 0, right? So to do that, you figure out, okay, well, how much of this reserves is required, right? We multiply 10% times the 2,000 in demand deposits. We get a figure of 200. So we know that required reserves are $200. So banks can only loan out if they have excess reserves. So in this case, the excess reserves is 0, right? Because all the reserves here are considered required. And therefore, part A, the answer is going to be 0. So that should be your explanation there, something to that effect. Okay, so now let's go to part B. Mr. Smith deposits $100 of cash in a demand deposit account. In his checking account, First Superior Bank. Calculate the maximum amount of new loans that First Superior Bank can now make based on a $100 deposit. Well, a bank can't turn around and loan out the entire deposit, right? What do they have to do when they take in $100 for a deposit? They have to take some out for required reserves, right? How much do they have to take out? Well, they got to take out 10% because that's what they told us the reserve ratio is, right? So what is that? That's $10. $10 of this has to go into required reserves, and the rest, what's left over, can be loaned out. So the answer here would be 100 minus 10 equals 90. And that's how much they can actually loan out to other customers based on the $100 deposit. Okay, so let's go to part C now. As a result of Mr. Smith's $100 cash deposit, calculate the maximum change over time in each of the following of the banking system. This should strike you as a money multiplier question. Anytime you see this, calculate the maximum change, you should think, for sure, think multiplier of some sort. In this case, it's a bank money multiplier, right? Okay, so but then we have two parts, and these are sort of subtle different. What happens to the change in the loans, and then what happens to the change in the demand deposit. So they're not the same answer, slightly different. So in the first one, how many more loans? So first of all, let's calculate the money multiplier. Money multiplier equals 1 over the reserve ratio, right? Equals 1 over 0.1 equals 10, right? So the money multiplier is 10 in this case with a reserve ratio of 10%. Okay, so now the question becomes, do we multiply it by the initial deposit or not? So in the case of this one, we're talking about loans. You have to think back to part B. So we ended up getting an answer of $90, right? So remember the $100 deposit, the bank is only able to loan out that initial $90. So the question is asking about how many new loans. So you got to take that $90 that is lent out and then multiply it by the money multiplier. So you should get an answer of $900 for that. Now, what happens to demand deposits? Well, this one, you don't have to take out that initial $10 for required reserves, because the demand deposit is there. It's still $100. So you take the initial $100 deposit in this case and multiply it by the money multiplier. So you should get an answer of 1,000 for that one. So they're very subtle things, but you're essentially doing the same thing. It's a money multiplier question. You just have to think specifically what they're asking about to get the difference there between those. Okay. Part D, as a result of Mr. Smith's $100 cash deposit, calculate the maximum change over time in the money supply. Okay, so this is essentially asking the same as what's going on here, right? How much is the being created in the money supply, which banks, when they create money, is essentially do that through new loans, right? So this is essentially the same answer as part one of C up above, right? So that should be 900. And then part E, provide one reason why the actual change in money supply can be smaller than the maximum change you identified in part D. Well, with the money multiplier, we are always assuming, and assumptions often don't match a real life, but we're assuming that everybody, every dollar will come back into the system, right? If somebody takes out a loan or makes a deposit, then the bank can loan the full amount, less the required ratio. And then it'll come back in, and so on and so forth, right, through that multiplying process. Well, that doesn't actually happen entirely in real life, and there's a number of reasons. So you really only have to answer one here. But so people could hold more money, right? And they don't deposit it back into the bank. So, whether they want to stuff it under their mattress, put it in a coffee can and bury it in their backyard, what have you, but all the money doesn't come back into the banking system, right? So there's some money leaving the system there. Another reason you could have put here, banks choose to hold more in reserves. Maybe they don't want to be quite as aggressive. They don't want to loan out their entire excess reserves. Maybe their forecast isn't so great, and they just want to be cautious, something to that effect. So a bank doesn't have to lend out everything that it has in reserves, right? Maybe they expect interest rates to go up in the future, and they're holding out for a better opportunity. But there are a number of reasons. So you really only had to have one of those there in part E. Either of these would have been